Hi everyone. So as Doug said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in his lab, and I've been in Doug's lab for the last 7 years doing my PhD as well. So a quick overview of the talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical trials and some clinical trials that are ongoing at the minute, and the main players within these trials. And I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing in our research group as well. Well, Doug's research group. So clinical trials are really kind of a four-phase system. So from phase 1 to phase 4 can take anywhere up to about 10 years before you actually get a drug out. And what we find is that there are an awful lot of drugs that enter, is this point? Yeah, so there's an awful lot of drugs that enter phase 1, so this is kind of the first phase after a lab stage, and these drugs get removed from clinical trials for various reasons. So by the time you get to here, you've got very few drugs that actually make it out into the market. But what also happens is that the actual cost of doing the trials increases massively as you move from phase 1 to phase 3. So this is another consideration with clinical trials because drug companies need to make sure that they're going to make their money back at the end of the day, which again is why there's so few drugs for any disease that come out every year. So phase 1 generally is just in healthy volunteers, so this is the first phase after the lab, and more that people want to find out is can the drug actually be tolerated in humans. This is typically done in young males because they get paid to do it. And after this stage, about 2/3 of drugs actually make it through. So only about 2/3 of drugs that are given to people for the first time are actually safe to give to them. The second phase, after we know that it is generally safe, is in patients. This is a phase 2, which is when we find out if the drug actually works in patients. So up until this point, most of the work's been done in animals or cell lines. So there's a very good idea that the drug will work in patients, but you don't know until you actually give it to a human. About a third of drugs make it through this stage. And normally, the reason they drop out is because it either doesn't work as well as we expect, or because there's a very specific side effect that is only found in patients. But once we get through this phase, we can move into phase 3, and this is the real large-scale clinical trials in patients. So this is up to hundreds or even thousands of patients over a couple of years or up to 5 years. And this is where we look for rare side effects and actually see if the drug does work as well as we expect. And about 60% of drugs make it through this stage, and then they can go onto the market. And phase 4 is really, once the drug's on sale, the drug companies have to continuously monitor to make sure that there's no side effects that they haven't thought about. So one recent example of a drug that failed this was Vioxx, which was given to people as an anti-inflammatory drug, but it actually caused heart attacks, so this had to get removed from the market. So even though drugs have gone through all these clinical trials, there are still risks associated with new drugs. So mitochondrial drug clinical trials are ongoing at the minute. So from 2010 up to this year, there are 41 trials ongoing that are only looking at mitochondrial disease. Of those, about half of them are currently recruiting or are open, and there's 4 that are currently ongoing and are active, and 10 that have been completed. The other box here are drugs that have had to be withdrawn, either for safety reasons or because the drug doesn't actually work. And the vast majority of these trials are actually going on in America at the minute. So there's 21 in the States and then 6 in Europe, which is mainly in France at the minute. So the main players with these drugs are 2 companies really at the minute. So Edison Pharmaceuticals, you may have heard of. So there's a statement about this new drug called EPI-743 on the Newcastle Mitochondrial Research Group website. So these guys are actually responsible for half of the clinical trials in mitochondrial disease at the minute. And they have a drug which they believe acts as an antioxidant and also increases the amount of energy made by mitochondria. So they think it can help patients with mitochondrial disease. They're currently in phase 2 trials, so they know that the drug's safe, but they're trying to work out how effective it is in treating patients. We don't know how effective it is because they don't tell the general scientific community. But they were just given a $35 million deal with a Japanese pharmaceutical company, so it's likely that they are doing something right. But these trials have yet to be completed, so hopefully they will have some really nice data and this drug can move on. The other big player is a company called Bio Therapeutics. So these guys are currently in phase 1 and phase 2 trials in the States. And they also have an antioxidant, but they know how this one works, and they've released information about how it actually works. And it's quite an exciting drug from my point of view, at least, because it's very novel and it should work, hopefully. Well, in cells it definitely works, but in patients, hopefully it will work as well. So to make energy in our mitochondria, so this is a little diagram of our mitochondria, we have to pass electrons across these 3 complexes. So when they're spaced apart like this, the rate of movement of these electrons isn't as efficient as it could be. But there's a very special molecule in our mitochondria called cardiolipin, which pulls these complexes together and decreases the distance these electrons have to go. So it means that the rate that they move across them is quicker, which means you get more energy produced, which is really good. But unfortunately, cardiolipin can be damaged. So we can go from this perfect situation where the electrons only have to move a short distance to where the cardiolipin gets damaged and they have to move a long distance. This isn't what we want. But Bio Therapeutics have found a way to stop this happening so that the complexes are always kept together, so your mitochondria should hopefully make the maximum amount of energy that they can. So this could potentially be very beneficial. But as I say, these guys are only in phase 1 trials at the minute, so hopefully more information will be released over the next few years about how effective this drug is. So what are we doing in Newcastle? Well, the MRG, as Doug alluded to, is looking for treatments, and we're actually thinking of starting a clinical trial ourselves. So this is using a drug called a Sipamox. So a Sipamox is currently used to treat high cholesterol. So because it's on the market already, it means we don't have to do the phase 1 stuff, we can go straight to phase 2. But I like to say it's used for high cholesterol, but we think it may also increase the amount of energy mitochondria can produce. So there's a team at Newcastle that are currently investigating its potential as a treatment for mitochondrial disease, and we're waiting the results on this, and once we know them, then I think the clinicians will make a decision about whether it's suitable for clinical trial, because although it may work in cells, then we need to decide if we think it will work in patients as well. But this is quite an interesting drug, and there's a lot of research in this area to try and increase mitochondrial energy production. The second thing we're doing is working with big pharmaceutical companies. So Novartis are absolutely massive. They're one of the big 6 pharmaceutical companies, and they're based in Switzerland. So the reason we're working with them is that for all the kind of will in the world, if we don't have compounds to try and use for screens to see if we can treat mitochondrial disease, then we're never going to do it. So they have a library of 2 million compounds that they know, roughly how safe they are, and we can use them to screen to see if they help mitochondrial disease. So our collaboration with them is primarily developing screens, but also trying to understand some disease mechanisms so that we can target our treatments. So this is going out quite well at the minute. So we're hoping to have our first screen underway in summer and completed probably in the autumn, and the first results from that screen. So that's really the first step in drug discovery, to try and find a treatment. But hopefully if we find something interesting, then we can move on in the screening process and maybe get to a phase 1 trial within 5 years, which I know sounds like a long time, but unfortunately this is kind of how long this process takes. The final thing we're doing, which is my real area of research, is trying to find drugs ourselves. So we think that if you increase the amount of mitochondria in a cell, it will compensate for the symptoms of mitochondrial disease, because you have more mitochondria, which means you produce more energy, which should lead to healthier cells. So as I said before, if you don't have the compounds, you can't screen. Well, we're collaborating with a small company in Newcastle who has a collection of 3,000 compounds, which is obviously a lot less than the 2 million of Novartis, but the compounds they have aren't found anywhere else in the world. So we're using this to try and also find compounds and and hopefully we'll move eventually into collaboration with Novartis if we do find something. So my work was really to try and see if any of these compounds can cause an increase in the amount of mitochondria in cells. So this is the kind of compounds that we found. So on the left is a picture of 2 cells, and what I've done is highlight their mitochondria in red. So this is using a stain that only stains mitochondria in these cells. And when we give the compound that we found to these cells, the amount of mitochondria doubles in the cell. So we're currently trying to work out how this compound actually works, but hopefully in the coming future we'll be able to move this into animal models and then maybe into a phase 1 trial ourselves. So that's kind of like a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the work that we're doing in Newcastle. So I guess I'll thank you all for listening and open it up to any questions.
Thanks very much, Ollie. It is open for questions. I think the thing that's remarkable is just how much it costs to bring a drug to market, isn't it? So
yeah, it's about $10 billion. Yeah.
Right. So that's for a big drug, but it's a massive amount of money. So clearly what many of these companies are hoping is that since mitochondria are involved in many different diseases, they're hoping that if they can develop a drug which treats mitochondrial disease, it might also be beneficial to patients with Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. So that's one of the reasons why we've got so much focus on mitochondrial disease, which is why it's hopeful. So I think that's probably shocked everybody. Any other points that people want to make?
The drugs that you're wanting to develop, will they be targeted across all muscle types, or will they be targeted to individual muscle types, like your smooth muscle and your mitochondrial muscle in your heart? Beg your pardon, your myocardic muscle in the heart?
Yeah. So these kind of drugs will be systemic, probably.
So it fit across the whole system, irrespective whether it's muscular or other organs. Thank you.
I think it's a very good question, because there's often many drugs which won't cross into the brain. And for many patients with mitochondrial disease, there is some brain involvement, so we need to have drugs which will target all tissues. Any other points? Again, Ollie will have a word with, will be around, so if you have any points. I think the important thing is that I feel as a clinician that looks after patients with mitochondrial disease, we are at a very, very interesting and important stage. And I think there is absolutely no doubt that we'll be running clinical trials with patients in mitochondrial disease over the next couple of years. Now, it might be that we'll be choosing very select groups of patients because we need to be sure that these drugs work, but the important thing is that there'll definitely be clinical studies going on in Newcastle, as there are in other centres around the world.